He was the greatest genius who ever lived: painter, sculptor, architect, musician, mathematician, engineer, anatomist, geologist, botanist, writer, inventor, one man, all of that. And yet, he left most of his work unfinished. He designed a flying machine 400 years before the Wright brothers. He mapped the human heart so accurately that modern surgeons still reference his drawings. He painted the most famous smile in history, and he spent the last years of his life convinced he had wasted it. How does this so talented human being in recorded history, a man who could do anything, end up feeling like a failure? And more importantly, what does his psychology tell us about our own? Leonardo wasn't broken, he wasn't lazy, he wasn't cursed. He was wired in a very specific way, and that same wiring that made him a god in the studio made him a ghost in real life. Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci was born on April 15, 1452, in a small village called Vinci, near Florence, Italy. Right away, his life started with a complication. He was illegitimate. His father, Ser Piero, was a successful notary. His mother, Caterina, was a peasant woman. They were not married. They never would be. Leonardo was raised mostly by his paternal grandparents and Uncle Francesco. His father eventually married someone else and had other children, legitimate ones. Leonardo was the brilliant mistake nobody quite knew what to do with. Because he was illegitimate, he couldn't attend a university. He couldn't become a lawyer or a doctor or follow his father's profession. So at age 14, he was apprenticed to Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the greatest artists in Florence. Within a few years, Leonardo had surpassed his master. Verrocchio reportedly put down his brush after seeing Leonardo's angel in a shared painting, and never painted again. His apprentice was simply better at everything. By his 20s, Leonardo was in the court of Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, and here's where the contradiction begins. In Milan, he was commissioned to create a massive bronze horse, a monument that would be the largest equestrian statue in the world. He spent 17 years on it. He never finished it. The clay model was eventually destroyed. The bronze he'd saved for it was melted down to make cannons. The Last Supper? A masterpiece, but painted in an experimental technique that began deteriorating almost immediately after he finished it. The Mona Lisa? He carried it with him for years, always tweaking, never declaring it done. In his notebooks, he wrote, "Tell me if anything was ever done." He was asking himself, because the man who could do everything struggled to complete anything. These weren't moral failures. Leonardo wasn't irresponsible, he wasn't flaky. He was psychologically structured in a way that made certain things almost impossible, while making other things supernatural. When Leonardo was roughly 2 years old, his mother Caterina married someone else. His father, Ser Piero, wealthy, respected, present in the city, was essentially absent from his daily life. Think about what that does to a child. You're gifted, you're curious, you notice everything. And the two people who were supposed to unconditionally love you have moved on. Psychologists call this early attachment disruption, and its fingerprints are all over Leonardo's adult life. He never married. He had very few close friends, and those friendships were often complicated and professional. He had a deeply personal relationship with one student, Gian Giacomo Caprotti, nicknamed Salai, who he took in at age 10, raised and kept close for nearly 30 years. Salai stole from him repeatedly, lied, misbehaved constantly, and Leonardo kept him anyway. That's not tolerance, that's attachment anxiety, holding on to someone because abandonment feels worse than dysfunction. Leonardo wrote in mirror script, right to left, so it could only be read with a mirror. For years, historians called it a clever code or a quirk of left-handedness. But some psychologists suggest something simpler. He was protecting himself. A man who grew up learning that the world doesn't always welcome you builds walls, even in his own notebooks. Here is a man who, at any given moment, was simultaneously studying how water moves around a rock, dissecting corpses at night in hospital morgues to understand muscles, designing canal systems, writing operas, sketching tanks, and analyzing bird wings, all at once. This isn't multitasking. This is a brain that cannot stop following its curiosity. Modern psychologists have retrospectively studied Leonardo, and many use the term hyperphantasia, combined with traits consistent with what we now recognize as ADHD, specifically the inattentive and hyper-focused profile. When Leonardo was interested in something, he was completely inside it. He once stopped in the middle of painting the Last Supper, walked across Milan, and stared at a criminal's face for hours because he needed to study the exact geometry of a villain's jaw. The prior of the church was furious and complained to the Duke. Leonardo's response was essentially, "The prior's face will do perfectly for Judas if he doesn't leave me alone." Brilliant, funny, also completely unable to operate within normal social expectations. Here's the dark side of hyperfocus. When the obsession moves on, the project gets frozen. Leonardo would get 80% of the way through something, and then a new idea would ignite, and the old project became a corpse. He left the adoration of the Magi unfinished, Saint Jerome in the wilderness unfinished, the Battle of Anghiari destroyed in an experiment gone wrong because he couldn't stop tinkering. His patrons were paying him. Deadlines came and went. Letters of complaint piled up, and Leonardo just kept following the next question. There's a story. Leonardo was commissioned to paint a portrait. He worked on it and worked on it for 4 years. The patron, Francesco del Giocondo, had commissioned the painting as a gift for his wife. Her name was Lisa. You know this painting. You've seen this painting. Leonardo never gave it to Francesco. He never declared it finished. He carried it with him to France, eventually, touching it up, adjusting, obsessing. When he died, it was still in his possession. The man who painted the most famous artwork in human history didn't think it was done. That is not a productivity problem. That is perfectionism at a clinical level, and it comes from a very specific place. When your internal standard is set impossibly high, finishing something means exposing it to judgment. As long as it's unfinished, it's still potentially perfect. The moment you release it, it can be criticized, compared, dismissed. For a child who grew up feeling fundamentally unwanted, external rejection isn't just uncomfortable. It confirms the deepest fear. I am not enough. So he kept working, not because he was lazy, but because stopping felt like losing. These 3 patterns, emotional detachment, hyperfocus, and perfectionism, don't exist in isolation. They feed each other, and they all trace back to the same root, a brain of extraordinary sensitivity, raised in a context of instability. Modern neuroscience tells us that highly creative, highly curious minds often have what researchers call reduced latent inhibition, meaning they filter out less of the world. Most people's brains automatically ignore stimuli that aren't immediately relevant. Leonardo's brain didn't. Every ripple in water, every shadow on a face, every way a bird's wing bent at a specific angle, it all came in, all the time. Now imagine being that child in a village in 1455. There's no name for what you are, no support structure, no framework. You're just overwhelming to be around, and somehow never overwhelming enough to be loved by the people who should have loved you unconditionally. So you learn to pour it all into work. Work doesn't leave. Work doesn't judge. Work doesn't marry someone else. This is what psychologists call sublimation, redirecting emotional pain into creative or intellectual output. It's not a bad coping mechanism. It produced the Mona Lisa. It produced flying machine designs 5 centuries ahead of their time. But it has a cost, because the same walls that keep pain out also keep intimacy out. And a life lived entirely inside the mind, even a mind like Leonardo's, is still, in the end, a lonely one. He wrote in one of his final notebooks, "I thought I was learning to live. I was only learning to die." That line has haunted philosophers for 500 years. But in context of everything we've just covered, it makes perfect, painful sense. He spent his whole life thinking, studying, creating. And somewhere in those final years in France, aging, partially paralyzed, his right hand no longer able to paint. He wondered if he had lived. Leonardo's emotional detachment wasn't a choice. It was a survival adaptation. But survival adaptations from childhood don't automatically expire when you're 30. They keep running in the background, shaping decisions you think are purely rational. The fix starts with noticing. When you pull back from someone, ask yourself, is this actually the smart move, or is this an old reflex? When you keep work hidden until it's ready, ask, ready for what? Whose approval am I protecting myself from? Name the emotion. Give it context. That alone reduces its power by half. Leonardo wrote obsessively in his notebooks, not to organize tasks, but to externalize his inner world. Try it, even 5 minutes. Write what you're actually feeling, not what you think you should be feeling. If you're someone who gets lost in ideas, stop trying to fix that. You're not broken, you're wired for depth. The problem isn't hyperfocus. The problem is unmanaged hyperfocus. Leonardo's biggest practical failures came when he had no external structure. When patrons were patient, he disappeared into ideas. When deadlines had teeth, when the Duke would literally come to the workshop, he delivered. He needed friction to finish. So build it deliberately. Set artificial deadlines. Make public commitments. Work with someone who will ask, where is it? The goal isn't to kill curiosity. The goal is to give it a container. Leonardo's perfectionism killed more great work than any lack of talent ever could. Here's a reframe that changes everything. Finished and imperfect beats perfect and invisible. The Mona Lisa that Leonardo never handed over exists because it was eventually pried from his estate. The hundreds of inventions he never built don't exist at all. Completion is an act of courage, not surrender. Every time you ship something, imperfect, incomplete feeling, not quite right, you are doing something Leonardo couldn't bring himself to do. That's not failure, that's strength. Finally, Leonardo ran thousands of failed experiments. His notes are full of things that didn't work. He documented them without shame because in his mind a failed experiment was data. The problem was, he couldn't apply that same logic to himself. Failed experiments were interesting. Personal failure was existential. Don't make that mistake. When something doesn't work, ask why, not what's wrong with me. Build a small practice. After anything that doesn't go as plans, write one sentence. What did this teach me? Not 3 paragraphs, not a spiral. One sentence. That's the difference between data and damage. Conclusion. Leonardo da Vinci was not a saint. He was not a simple success story. He was a man of almost incomprehensible gifts, shaped by early loss, raised in instability, driven by a curiosity that never, ever rested. He changed how we see the human body. He imagined machines we didn't build for 400 years. He painted a smile that has confused and captivated the world for half a millennium. And he died at 67 in France, cared for by a young king who loved him, believing he had wasted his potential. The gap between what you're capable of and what you feel you've achieved is not a measure of your worth. It's a measure of how high you've set an internal standard that may have been designed years ago by a wound, not by wisdom. Leonardo's failures weren't failures of talent. They were failures of completion, of connection, of permission. Permission to be human. Permission to be enough. So the next time you look at your unfinished projects, your avoided conversations, your ideas you haven't started yet, don't ask what's wrong with you. Ask what's driving you. Because the same engine that keeps you from finishing things might be the exact same engine that will eventually produce your masterpiece. You just have to learn to drive it.